Welcome to the S.J. Stubbs Lecture in English Literature here at the Paul Cadario Conference Center. My name is Sally Tagliamonte, and I'm the acting principal of University College. I'm also a professor of linguistics and a Canada Research Chair in language variation and change. Let us come together with intellectual curiosity, openness to new ideas, and a common goal to learn more about Professor Pettit's exploration of what is referred to as the long 20th century, so named because its influence extends beyond 100 years. She will introduce us to the idea that literature and visual arts in the second half of the century were not just about new digital media, but also created the cultural conditions for their diffusion and widespread uptake. Interestingly, the time frame is just as University College was being built and founded as a place where individuals of all backgrounds agreed to come together in the interests of a coherent system of higher education. But before we hear about the past, I would like to begin with the earth under our feet. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across North and Central America, a territory called Turtle Island. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I ask that you take a moment to reflect on the Indigenous heritage of the place where you live and work, and its contribution in the trajectory of human development that has brought us to this present day. As we listen to Professor Pettit's lecture today, perhaps we can reflect on the relevance of white gold to our own extractive history. The S.J. Stubbs Lecture in English Literature was established in 1988 by Helen Eunice Stubbs in honor of her father, Samuel James Stubbs. Both of them were graduates of University College. The lecture tonight honors Professor Stubbs' love of English literature. In this regard, we are extremely honored to have Professor Clare Pettitt here with us. Professor Pettitt is Grace II Chair in the Faculty of English at Cambridge University in the UK. Before we introduce Professor Pettitt, I want to give you some quick housekeeping rules for the lecture tonight. For those attending in person, a microphone will be passed around during the Q&A portion of today's lecture. Please raise your hand high to ask a question once the lecture concludes. Please speak into the microphone that will be passed to you rather than speaking without one, in order that our audience online can hear your questions. For those of you attending virtually, I hope you can hear me. Live closed captioning is available for this event. You can select this option by clicking the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please use the Zoom chat function to submit your online questions. Andrew Chang, our virtual facilitator, is on duty. He will read out your questions during the session. I will now call upon Professor Daniel Wright to introduce our distinguished speaker from the disciplinary perspective. Dan.
Thanks, Professor Tagliamonte. It's my great honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Clare Pettitt. Can you hear me if it's that low? Yes. And to share with those of you who are encountering her work for the first time, really an all too brief narrative of her brilliant and distinguished career as a scholar of 19th century literature and culture. As you've already heard, Professor Pettitt is Grace II Professor of English at the University of Cambridge, where she's a fellow of Emmanuel College. She's the author of countless essays on, I really want to emphasize this, an extraordinary range of topics. From transatlantic literary exchange to Charles Dickens, to Sherlock Holmes, to Henry James, to the telegraph, to 19th century women's scrapbooks. She's also the author of 4 excellent books. The first, Patent Inventions, Intellectual Property in the Victorian Novel, published by Oxford University Press in 2004. The second, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, Missionaries, Journalists, Explorers, and Empire, from Profile Books and Harvard University Press in 2007. And I want to focus especially on her two most recent books, Serial Forms, The Unfinished Project of Modernity, 1815 to 1848, from Oxford in 2020, and most recently, Serial Revolutions, 1848, Literature, Politics, Form, also from Oxford in 2022. These two most recent books are part of a planned trilogy, which spans the period from 1815 to 1914, and investigates the concept of seriality and its importance to the emergence of a particular version of Western modernity. I'm editorializing now, but this trilogy in progress, for those of you who haven't already had a look at it, is mind-blowing, field-redefining research, that rare combination of an incredibly ambitious project that's executed really to perfection. And you don't have to take my word for it. Serial Forms won the British Academy's Rosemary Crochet Prize, the North American Victorian Studies Association's annual book prize, and the Esprit Prize from the European Society for Periodical Studies. Professor Pettitt is now at work on the third volume in this trilogy, Serial Transmissions, which asks what happens to the nationalisms of 1848 after mid-century and the inauguration of electronic digital communication. The book will argue that literature and the visual arts in the second half of the 19th century are not just reflecting or representing the new digital media, but also creating the cultural conditions for their uptake and application. I can't help but think it's appropriate that we're here in the home of Marshall McLuhan. This is work that really argues that the medium is the message. As if all of that weren't enough, Professor Pettitt is also at work on co-authoring a book with art historian Caroline Arscott with the working title Germinal Matter, Idylls and Ecospheres in the Art and Literature of the 1860s. This brief account gives you a sense of Professor Pettit's vital contributions to scholarship on 19th century Britain, but perhaps just as important is her work in sort of circulating and making knowledge in other ways. She's a regular book reviewer for the Times Literary Supplement. She led a really wonderful seminar with many of our undergraduate and PhD students representing all three of our U of T campuses this morning. And also currently serves as an editor on the 19th Century Literature and Culture series at Cambridge University Press, one of the really important and kind of field-shaping series in our field. I hope that you'll all share my enthusiasm in joining me to welcome Professor Clare Pettitt.
Thank you, Daniel. That was such a lovely introduction. And the seminar this morning was only great because of your wonderful students, some of whom I can see are here. So thank you for being so great in that seminar this morning. So without further ado, I will put my glasses on. That would help. Okay. Go. Right. In Ford Madox Brown's 1855 oil painting, The Last of England, an emigrant couple stared dolefully at the receding white cliffs of Dover as they set off towards Australia on a ship which Brown has significantly named the El Dorado. The picture was partly inspired by the departure for Australia on the 24th of July, 1852, of Madox Brown's friend, the pre-Raphaelite poet and sculptor, Thomas Woolner. Woolner was one of the founder members of the English Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a group of young British painters, all male, who admired and aspired to the purpose and tendency of early Italian art. In 1845, Woolner had won the Society of Art's silver medal, but despite his early success, he was failing to make an adequate living from sculpture. And so, declaring British sculpture to be in the doldrums, he threw in the trowel or the mallet and left England to join the Australian gold rush. He travelled with two other young artists, Edward Latrobe Bateman, who was a designer and draftsman, and Bernard Smith, a sculptor. The three were seen on board ship, which was in fact the Windsor and not the El Dorado, at Gravesend by their pre-Raphaelite artist friends William Holman Hunt, Ford Madox Brown, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Rossetti noticed that they were all plentifully stocked with corduroys, sou'westers, jerseys, firearms, and belts full of little bags to hold the expected nuggets. The three reached Port Phillip, Victoria, at the end of October 1852. One of Woolner's travelling companions, Edward La Trobe Bateman, was the cousin of Lieutenant Governor La Trobe in Melbourne. Woolner was therefore invited to dine with that great man, and he was delighted to discover a Parian-ware copy of his own little figure of Red Riding Hood in the governor's Melbourne study, and to hear from La Trobe himself that it was, quotes, one of his favourite ornaments. "How queer that Mr. La Trobe should have your little Red Riding Hood," exclaimed Dante Gabriel Rossetti to Woolner in a letter from London. But it perhaps was not actually so queer. In his 1848 handbook for settler colonists travelling to New Zealand, Edward Wakefield had remarked that the colonist, who is anxious to carry with him the memorials of the fine arts of the Old World, may do so at comparatively little cost by purchasing at the British Museum casts in plaster of the antiques contained in that institution, some of which could be easily conveyed to the colony at little cost, affording very tasteful ornaments. Along with the prefab wooden bungalow packed in flat pieces, Governor La Trobe had taken with him small copies of contemporary and classical sculptures from Britain to Australia. So Woolner spent a pleasant week among the governing elite of Melbourne before setting off with his companions for the goldfields at Ovens Valley and Friars Creek. 8 uncomfortable and dangerous months on the diggings ensued, but the expected nuggets did not materialise. So Woolner returned to Melbourne and started up a business sculpting plaster portrait medallions for powerful colonial families in Victoria, some of whom were newly enriched by the gold rush and ready to enhance their cultural status by commissioning artworks. As a temporary settler, Woolner was enlisted into the work of unmaking and remaking nationhood in Victoria, Australia, in the 1850s. Eileen Morton Robinson, writing about the Australian settler colonial period, has suggested that the task today is to name and analyse whiteness in all texts, to make it visible in order to disrupt its claims to normativity and universality. And Woolner's series of Australian portrait medallions of governors and politicians were, in a sense, texts that were surely intended as foundational to the creation of a white myth of origin for a colony that stood on land that had been seized from First Nations people in 1840. In the spring of 1854, Woolner moved his workshop to Sydney for a few months, where the Sydney newspapers reported that he had secured, quotes, more commissions than he can possibly execute, and has been obliged to refuse some. In July, he returned home to London and capitalised on his colonial success. Later in his long career, he won lucrative contracts for monumental public sculptures of colonial heroes, for example, of Captain Cook, here in Hyde Park, Sydney, and Stamford Raffles in Singapore. Perhaps rather surprisingly, both are still standing in Sydney and Singapore, although Captain Cook does become the focus of some dissent quite regularly. Alongside these long-distance public commissions, Woolner continued all his life to sculpt portrait medallions of leading British writers, politicians, and thinkers such as Thomas Carlyle, William Gladstone, Alfred Tennyson, and Robert Browning. Indeed, Woolner himself was a poet of some reputation in his lifetime. His pre-Raphaelite poem, My Beautiful Lady, was published in volume form in 1863. A friend of the poet laureate, Alfred Tennyson, and of the educationalist Francis Palgrave. He worked with them both on the selection of poems for what would prove to be, quote, the most significant anthology in English literary history, Palgrave's Golden Treasury, of the best songs and lyrical poems in the English language, which was published in 1861 and rapidly entered the global colonial canon. So this afternoon, I want to ask what might be the connections between Woolner's temporary settler colonial life in Australia and the object life of the Golden Treasury anthology. I think that Woolner's story can tell us something about extraction and seriality in the context of global mobility and distance in the mid-19th century. The 1850s and 60s, as historian Dane Kennedy has written, were transitional years that reveal, quotes, the problem that confronted the Victorians as they struggled to reconcile liberal ideals with imperial power. In an attempt to address this problem, culture was packaged, mediated, and remediated through portable and dispersible forms, such as sculpture and poetry. And on a more general level, this story of the sculpture and poetry of the 1850s and 60s shows obliquely but powerfully how the digital future was already forming as the organizational matrix within which we still live today. So this is a story about art and literature in a colonial context, and a story about liberalism under the pressure of imperialism, and a story of the origins of neoliberal digital technology. Woolner's highly portable sculpted medallions served an important function at a time when the city of Melbourne was only 17 years old, so that a full-blown colonial architecture was not yet in place, although it was already being planned. The land for St Patrick's Cathedral in Melbourne, for example, was granted by the colonial government in 1851. Designs were solicited in 1858, but the cathedral was not consecrated until 1897, and even then it was still unfinished. At present, it is a capital that is neither lighted, paved, nor drained, remarked William Howitt, who'd arrived in Australia from England a month before Woolner in September 1852. The houses are some of them complete, he continued. Others are just erecting. Every single tree has been levelled to the ground. It is one hard, bare expanse, bare of all nature's attractions, a wilderness of wooden huts. On the south bank of the Yarra River at Emerald Hill, Governor La Trobe had set aside land for lime juicers, or incoming migrants, in 1852, which filled up rapidly with tents. Canvas Town, as it was dubbed, appeared like a, quotes, confused swarm of tents pitched at random, like a flock of pigeons after a long flight. The gold diggings accelerated white settlement at a time when Victoria was already booming. James Bellich has shown that the gold rushes were Anglo-prone and racist, but also transnational. On and around the goldfields, the transnational phenomenon of whiteness found powerful expression, connecting Anglo miners and drawing the global colour line with greater clarity and density. Tensions between the colonial authorities and the miners over mining licenses, alongside tensions between different groups of white miners, resentment of the perceived ascendancy of the Irish in the goldfields, and racism against Chinese bonded labourers would explode just a few months after Woolner had returned to England. The Eureka blockade and massacre in early December 1854 at Ballarat, when at least 27 rebels were killed by government troops, revealed how bitterly the mostly anti-British individualist and populist Republican miners opposed public taxation by the British Crown's governorship. The leaders of the Goldfield insurgents included Chartists who'd been transported to Australia by the British state to prevent revolution in 1848. An African-American man, a man of African descent from Jamaica, and Raffaele Carboni, who'd fought with Garibaldi for the Italian nationalist cause. In some ways, a continuation of the revolutionary year of 1848, then, the 1854 dispute was over the proper form of democracy. In this extremely tense interim period of the early 1850s in Melbourne and then in Sydney, Woolner's portrait medallions were welcomed as movable pieces of an imagined colonial architecture, helping to deliver a temporary scenography of Renaissance prestige to the British governing class, much needed at that time as a suggestive backdrop for the fragile colonial administration. In November 1854, the New South Wales exhibition opened in the Sydney Museum, offering Sydney residents a preview of items that were destined for the Paris International Exhibition the following year. Some of Woolner's plaster medallions, proudly labelled as recently executed here, were displayed alongside the cotton of Moreton Bay and other raw material, wool, timber, and animal hides. Specimens of gold from nearly all the numerous localities where it has been found were arrayed in display cases. Sir Alfred Stephen, in his opening speech, remarked that, quotes, "the exhibition bears far more of a prospective than of a retrospective character." And he congratulated the settlers on, quotes, "the prodigal profusion with which a beneficent providence has enriched this territory." The exhibition was future-focused because the colony was future-focused. The futures market was routed through Europe by the technological networking of empires that used railways, telegraphs, and steamboats to facilitate and accelerate the extraction and removal of wealth from the colonies. For Woolner and the other diggers, the division of Australian land into thousands of individual claims made every patch into a unit of probability in an emergent futures-focused risk economy that was exclusively white. The gold nugget was one of the extractable and exportable raw materials of empire. Yet Adeline Buckland has suggested that matter can only exist as a raw material through the interactions of imperial and industrial networks of power. steamships, factories and railways, slavery, colonialism and indentured labour, particular ideas about the geological and evolutionary depth of time. The construction of the raw material of the gold nugget is made in the service of a logic that made empire and industry appear natural, homogeneous, and inescapable. This is the same logic that Patrick Wolfe has called the logic of elimination, a systemic and naturalized ongoing removal of the native, which leads, according to Wolfe, to the present-day ideology of multicultural neoliberalism. "This will be a beautiful land," wrote Woolner of Australia, "when brought properly under man's sway." He meant, of course, under white man's sway. But First Nation people were present and working on the diggings. William Howitt recorded seeing diggers camping on First Nation burial sites, quotes, "heaps of wood ashes, partly overgrown with grass and resembling the barrows of the ancient Britons. They are called native ovens. They contain many wagon loads of ashes and are found all about this neighbourhood, especially near the creeks." In his diary, Woolner seems surprised and even affronted when these inhabitants occasionally appear. And I warn you, this is a nasty racist quote coming up from Woolner, but I think it's important that we hear it. So he writes in his diary, "Two ugly blacks paid us a visit tonight. They came in a most stealthy way, which is natural to the animal, I suppose." He wrote this in his diary with insouciant racism, without for a moment considering who exactly were really the visitors in this scenario. The wandering mobility of First Nation people was taken by some, but not all, white commentators as proof of their so-called savage state and inability to fix or settle to steady labour. Their present uncivilized and wandering habits, as a witness to the Select Committee on Aborigines put it. It was an irony that went unnoticed that many of the gold diggers themselves had rushed from all over the world to the goldfields. They too were wandering and itinerant. Woolner racialized the other diggers as gypsies. "All the men look like gypsies," he said, but he resisted this identity himself. He claims to be disgusted by the colonists and settlers who, quotes, "heed nothing but corn, sheep, and the accumulation of gold." His self-separation comes from, in his own words, quotes, "the dread of becoming so reconciled to here as not to reach England, to yield what I have hoped and striven for, to step down a little lower in creation." Nevertheless, the diggers enlisted First Nation skill and knowledge when they needed it. For example, when Woolner's digging companion Henry Pynchon drowned in a creek, Woolner records that, quotes, "we've been dragging the river all morning, but to no purpose. A black woman was diving for a long time, but could not find him. Now we are in a very unsettled state and know not what to do." Indeed, Woolner describes First Nation people, quotes, "all stretched about in the sun, looking as if the place was theirs, but they were there only on sufferance. They had the appearance of an old race who felt their power had passed from them, but they were born and would eat and live as at little trouble as possible." All the tropes of a lazy and therefore naturally disappearing race, of course, are rehearsed here, and Woolner is very far from confronting the fact that by the 1850s, violence against First Nation people in colonial Australia was already entrenched. As here, in his diary, they appear on the edges of white gold rush narratives, consigned by the stadial theory of imperialism to an earlier time, and therefore irrelevant to the important and energetic extractive work at hand. It's curious, therefore, that one of the longest and most passionate entries in Woolner's gold digging diary concerns his reading of the recently published novel Uncle Tom Sabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Woolner is moved by the book's piety, honesty, and kindness, and he thinks that it would be hard to read this book and think philosophically upon slavery immediately after. "I fancy it must rouse many ardent young Americans to try doing something for the unjustly treated men whose skin is not white. Yes, I think it may be set down as one of the good things to hope for. Divine indignation bursting the old-grown incrustation of the devil's imps who inhabit the earth in the form of grave, cautious men of state, sapient professionals, lay and clerical, wise businessmen who knock out a good living by being philanthropic. The black man would look grim, glaring as conqueror over prostrated white man." Woolner reads this novel in the goldfields, surrounded by the evidence of violence, dispossession, and the dehumanization of First Nation people, and is overcome with sentimental enthusiasm for the emancipation of black enslaved people in America. The reduction of black flesh to a fungible and ultimately disposable material has been theorized, of course, by Hortense Spillers, Saidia Hartman, Sylvia Winter, and others as black fungibility. Tiffany Lethabo-King describes how, quotes, the exchange and circulation of black bodies becomes liquid or a commodity form that can stand in for other commodity forms and other meanings, an important one being the raw material of the human. And crucially, she says, this fungibility unites African Americans with indigenous and native peoples. At the stress points and instantiations of black fungibility and native genocide, the violence moves as one. Although he calls First Nation people black, Woolner doesn't see that not only is the same logic of extraction and violence at work in Australia, but also that he is himself deeply entangled and complicit with it. There was as yet no art foundry in Australia for metal casting. The Empire newspaper reported that Mr. Woolner's works since he's been here have been necessarily confined to portrait medallions, for we believe the colony does not afford either the materials or mechanical appliances necessary to execute a statue or a bust in marble or bronze. Woolner complained that I should be able to make some money quickly if it were not for the difficulty I have with plaster of Paris. That which is sent from England gets damp with sea air and is spoilt for artistic purposes. The powers of concretion of the gypsum, which made it a suitable material for casting, that is, for receiving and reproducing information, could also destroy it on a long sea voyage around the world. This is an instance of long-distance communicative breakdown. As Jennifer Roberts has noted, if information is to be communicated from one place to another, it must not lose its shape along the way. Liquid intelligence, if its role in relay and transfer is to be theorized, must somehow include a principle of inscription, fixation, or memory. Liquid intelligence must have some modicum of fix to go with its flux. Woolner's shipments of plaster of Paris were liable to fix prematurely. In the end, it was Woolner's own material expertise that rescued his sculpting plan in Melbourne. He took matters into his own hands, quite literally, actually. I had a piece of gypsum given me, which was a godsend, he says, and I have to break it into small pieces and then bake it in an oven, then pound it finely in a mortar, and after that, sift it through fine muslin. All this before one cast can be taken. I had to make some modelling tools ere I began and dig in the earth for some clay. This I could do to perfection after my 8 months digging experience. Once he'd made the plaster of Paris and the tools and dug the clay, he was able to start work. In a very short space of time, gold had transformed Melbourne from a rickety white settlement to a Renaissance city with its own princely class. Woolner sold his medallions in plaster, promising his patrons and clients that once back in London, he would have them cast in bronze and sent back to Australia. He charged handsomely for his work, remarking in a letter to his father that I get £25 for a medallion here. In England, they wouldn't give me 25 pence. When he left Australia in 1854, he carefully packed a trunk full of master copies of the plaster medallions that he'd sculpted during his trip. But to his great distress, this precious trunk got lost in transit. When it was eventually found and returned to him, he wrote gratefully in his diary that it was a great delight to hear this and has removed a great weight from my mind. Without my medallions, I should be like a man on an uninhabited district or island. It's not clear. It's a manuscript source. It's not quite clear what that word is. But with little food and having lost his stock of seed that he meant should serve him in times to come. Emigrants to settler colonies would often take with them seeds of familiar flowers and fruit to cultivate in the colony, but Woolner's seeding capital moves the other way, from the colony to the metropolis. Plaster was the fugitive medium of transition for sculpture, allowing Woolner to bring the physiognomic impressions that he'd extracted in Australia back to London, to remediate them into precious bronze, and then refloat them back to Australia. His colonial medallions grew for him in another way too, as they were greatly admired by the London literati and political class, and new British commissions rolled in. In other words, he was able to reap the harvest from the seeds that he brought from the colonies, often selling bronze casts of the same portrait several times over to different buyers on opposite sides of the world. In the British Museum in the 1840s, Woolner had seen and admired examples of the work of Pisanello and Matteo de' Pasti from the mid-15th century. So the form of the architecturally autonomous and portable bronze medallion was familiar to him from these Renaissance examples, themselves gesturing back in their iconography to ancient Roman coins. Woolner's medallions materialize imperial and civic power, invoking both the Roman Empire and the Florentine city republic of the 14th century. They evince a pre-Raphaelite confidence that the past can be made to speak clearly through the present. The inherent mobility of the medallion as a form is highly adaptable to a colonial sovereignty, which is deterritorialized whilst also settled. Woolner's Australian medallions announced their potential as architectural ornaments, and in fact, later in his career, his tondi, they're called tondi in an architectural setting, his medallions were set into buildings, but the Australian ones were not. But they are portable objects. They are unfixed, while they suggest fixture. They're also ambivalently suspended between the private domestic and the public civic. They're able to manifest a public persona in private, or equally able to be envisaged as in some way a public fixture. The medallion is therefore a form that's well adapted to marking and mediating the uneasy boundaries between domestic and public space in the developing white colony. In the early 1850s in Melbourne and then Sydney, Woolner's portrait medallions were movable pieces of an imagined city architecture, and they helped to construct the white space of the newly established colonial administration and to deliver Renaissance prestige as a suggestive backdrop for a new political system. The medallion form, which had historically signified ownership and power, lent itself particularly well to this colonial foundational role. In the Renaissance, portrait medallions of patrons were ritually buried in the foundation pits of new buildings, and sometimes multiple copies were bricked into walls as a means of signing the building project. But also, I think, with a more apopatreic or protective meaning. Woolner's medallions perhaps performed an apopatreic function too, drawing the racial boundaries of the colony visibly and clearly as part of a project to make the settler indigenous to the land he occupies. Woolner's medallions were also hypermobile, as we've seen. He sent them across the world. In 1856, Woolner wrote to Tennyson's wife that I was at the Brownings last night. I took them a cast of Mr. Tennyson's medallion. They were immensely pleased, meant to have it framed and carry it about with them wherever they went. The married poet, the Brownings, carried the portrait medallion of Tennyson back to Florence with them and displayed it proudly in their home in Casa Guidi. That year, the same medallion was remediated onto paper as the frontispiece to the important 1857 Moxon illustrated edition of Tennyson's poems, a book that's quite important in sort of book history generally. It boasted lavish woodcut illustrations designed by pre-Raphaelite artists Dante Gabriel Rossetti, John Millais, and William Holman Hunt. By the mid-19th century, plaster had indeed become one of the communications technologies of empire, alongside print and telegraph cables. I'll think a bit more about plaster. At the same time that Woolner was packing up his plaster portrait medallions in his trunk and preparing to leave Australia, the Select Committee on Aborigines in Victoria were ordering plaster casts of the heads of the Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation to be made by the Melbourne-based phrenologist and cast maker Philemon Sahir. Sahir was not to make portraits, but rather phrenological casts. Phrenology, as I'm sure you all know, was the so-called science of reading the bumps on the head as indicative of intellectual propensities and moral traits, and it was very popular in Europe and North America in the first half of the 19th century. I found little evidence yet of whether or how Sahir made these casts and whether he cast from live people or not. Racist phrenological science had created a dangerous market in Australia. The following year, in 1856, Sahir was charged with incitement to grave robbing in a case involving the heads of two First Nation prisoners recently executed at Maitland Jail. Whatever actually happened with Sahir's commission, the story remains an extremely disturbing one. There are records that show that 10 years later, in 1866, 16 Kulin people were subjected to life casting at the order of Redmond Barry, a colonial Supreme Court judge and president of the trustees of the Melbourne Museum of Art. Barry ordered plaster busts to be made for the Melbourne International Exhibition, and these busts then went on tour on the international exhibition circuit. Life casting is a very uncomfortable procedure for the subject, and it's unclear how coercive the process was. The process of obtaining these casts was. The violence of their production is masked quite literally by the white silence of their form. Since the early 19th century, plaster casts have been used to create racial series. When the Scottish phrenologist George Coombs's Edinburgh Phrenological Society published a catalogue of casts of skulls of different nations, which were available for sale in 1830, they explained that each skull had been, quotes, selected from a number of the same tribe or nation so as to present as nearly as possible a type of the whole. The heads are clearly not conceived of as portraits of individuals, but as anthropometric averages that purport to stand for racial type. So is there any connection between Woolner's travelling trunk of plaster portrait medallions of patrician politicians and these other travelling plaster casts of faces, the phrenological casts of First Nation Australians, other than that they were all being produced in colonial Victoria and exported at exactly the same time? A sculpted portrait and a live body cast create very different qualities of presence, of course. One is created at a distance, the other involves direct skin contact. One, although highly mediated by the sculptor, is intended to capture the individual character of the sitter. The other, although made by direct impressment in several senses, is intended to capture the general or standardized features of a supposed racial type. The plaster life casts of the Kulin Nation sitters are startlingly funerary. Their eyes are necessarily closed, and it's impossible to know by looking at them whether the person cast was alive or dead at the time of casting. I'm not showing them, of course, but they bear an uncanny resemblance to the death masks of executed criminals that Sahir displayed as sensational exhibits at his Melbourne Waxworks and Phrenological Museum. Woolner only ever cast directly from the flesh when he was commissioned to make death masks. This is a death mask he made of Turner and a bust of Dickens, which was made from the evidence of a death cast of Dickens. Whether live cast or cast from a dead body, all the plaster casts of First Nation people's heads were conceptually funerary. This was an explicit and urgent commission to create a record of the Kulin people. The casts concretized the colonial trope of the last of a dying race, although, of course, it's actually important to note that First Nations people have survived in Australia despite all attempts to eliminate them. Woolner's medallions, which restore the great civilizations of the past to the present, and the imagined ruins of the Kulin Nation consigning the First Nation people to the past, are therefore conjoined in dark and difficult ways. Despite their differences, I think it is obvious that both types of cast are the racialized product of white colonial power, merely applied in different directions. Bracketing the casts together reveals the unstable and uneasy status of portraiture in the carceral society of the colony. In the spring of 1854, on the eve of his departure for England, Woolner was relentlessly advertising his medallions, almost daily in the Sydney papers, with a testimonial from William Wentworth himself. Under the heading Works of Art, readers of the radical working class paper The People's Advocate and New South Wales Vindicator were informed that Woolner's plaster medallion of old Billy Wentworth was currently on display in town, opposite a bookseller's shop, which has in its window a profile portrait of the boy Roberts, recently acquitted of murder. The article explains that we have brought the two subjects together in one paragraph simply from a desire to be equitable. And it goes on to discuss the relative artistic merits of each portrait, questioning the similitude of Woolner's rendering of the ugly mug of Wentworth, and by contrast, the innocence of the poor youth wrongly arrested for murder, who is possessed of a very attractive and agreeable cast of countenance. The article imagines Woolner's portrait as a death mask, as, quotes, the artist must have depicted the old nabob as undergoing the extreme penalty of the law, in fact, just turned off. Only fancy, any person for the trifling sum of £5, 5 shillings, may have a brazen likeness of the cross-jack-eyed old traitor to hang around his neck. The switching of criminality from the boy Roberts to the governor Wentworths suggests the arbitrariness and slippage of violence in the new colony. Much later in his career, in the 1880s, Woolner was commissioned by the Premier of the colony of New South Wales and the City of London to make a series of marble busts of British premiers to be sent to Sydney for display in the Gothic Revival-style Government House. The British Prime Minister, William Gladstone, confessed to Woolner that it was not clear to him where this series should rightly begin. "I'm a little embarrassed about the question of the four," wrote Gladstone, "and I'm not quite certain of the date from which responsible government in New South Wales should be reckoned." Lord Russell, however, the first on the list, was the first minister, I think, who ever recognised responsible government for colonies. "I have no doubt that carrying this series of busts to Sydney would be a graceful and acceptable testimony to the good relations subsisting between these locally severed branches of our race, and would tend to confirm them." The advent of responsible government dated to 1855 to 1856, but Lord Russell had indeed supported the proposal earlier than this. The ambition to use sculpture to rejoin the locally severed branches of our race introduces an explicit racial motive for Woolner's series. Note that Gladstone does not say locally severed branches of our nation. The colonial serial is racial, not national. By the 1880s, the increased reach and penetration of new communications technologies was changing colonial governance systems. The seriality of the busts will model the origins and ongoing development of responsible government, which is colonial government which answers to Westminster. It will show an orderly genealogy of whiteness reaching through time and into the future, continuing the colonial project. Woolner's series of busts was intended symbolically to gather up the scattered disjecta membra of the white colonial settlers and to reunite and order them under their subsequent leaders so that this series could act as an auxiliary technology, a chain of power between Westminster and Sydney. Likewise, Captain Cook, who ended his life by being killed and ritually dismembered by the Hawaiian people who he'd offended and abused, was remembered and put back together again into a commanding corporeal hold in London and shipped back to Australia in the form of Woolner's colossal bronze statue. It's easy to dismiss Woolner's portrait medallions as ornaments, the kind of expensive knickknacks with which leisured Victorians famously loved to clutter up their parlours, gathering dust for their poor housemaids to clean. But it would be a mistake to dismiss the revenant form of the portrait medallion as trivial. Ornament orders. Ornament is relational. It creates, or maybe more precisely, it engineers relationships between people and buildings, between citizens and institutions. Each element in Woolner's lifelong medallion series of great men has something in common with the others, both in format and content. But at the same time, each one is emphatically individual, unique, and irreplaceably itself. The series is therefore established as linked and open-ended. It unspools forward into the future. By contrast, the casts of the First Nation Australians are not imagined as individuals, but like Francis Galton's composite photographs of the same period, they're stilled and held in place by racial type, not one but many piled and collapsed together. Somewhat like a compressed digital image, they lack all information that's surplus to their intended use. These phrenological casts are not serial. There's no sense of sequence for the Kulin nation, and therefore no sense of generation, reproductivity, or future development. Seriality in the 19th century, it seems, was an exclusively white concept, enacting an exclusively colonial temporality. So I'm going to say a little bit more about seriality. As you've heard, I've been working for some time now, probably rather too long, on the idea of seriality. And I'm interested not only in how the serial became the most significant literary form of the 19th century, which of course it did, but also, and connectedly, how a new understanding of serial time came to underpin social and political life in ways that still persist today. And the book that I'm now trying to write, which has changed its title actually recently to, and I'm still not happy with this title, but Digital Empire, Serial Code Writing and Resistance, 1848 to 1914, investigates seriality as conceptually underpinning all the infrastructures of empire. International telegraphic communication was embedded by the 1860s, at the same moment that bodies were starting to be scientifically coded as black, white, normal, abnormal, empowered, or victimized. As long-distance cable networks started to ramify across the world, pulsating with running code, which was itself a series of electrical events, Charles Darwin was developing his theory of gemmules, speculating wrongly, as it turned out, about how their development in the next generation forms a new being. Darwin's half-cousin, Francis Galton, took a more accurate step towards imagining the sequencing of the human genome when he modelled genetics as a continuous mathematical series, with parents contributing 1/2 of the heritage of their offspring, grandparents 1/4, great-grandparents an eighth, and so on. I'm particularly interested in the seriality of these emergent models, but also in their often unregarded racial biases. Between 1848 and 1870, European humanitarian liberalism was, in Keith Breckenridge's words, quotes, overthrown by a pessimistic and brutal justification of imperial domination as biologically ordained racial supremacy. Breckenridge has pointed out that Francis Galton, who was also the inventor of identificatory fingerprinting, developed his anthropometrics as a result of what Galton himself termed an adventure in southwest Africa. Galton spent 2 years between 1850 and 1852 in what is now Namibia. His statistical concepts of standard deviation, correlation, and regression would underpin his biometrics, his notorious eugenic theory, and his pseudoscientific racism. While he was working on his protogenetic theory, he was also working on a prototype of a printing electric telegraph called the teletype. Galton envisaged a network of these machines in every household, replacing the penny postal service as the medium of personal correspondence. Later in his career, Galton developed a way of transmitting biometric data across long distances by telegraph, claiming peculiarities of profile as a racial or family characteristic can be expressed numerically, which will be serviceable for eugenic records. He added that 4 telegraphic words are sufficient to convey a very fair profile likeness. These new kinds of coding are embedded in, or actually I would argue, actually emerging out of, the racialized and racist thinking of the mid-19th century. Galton's desire to digitize human characteristics is clear, and it's a direct response to the extension of sovereignty across distance, increased mobility, and attendant anxieties about diminishing international security as the empire grew. The 1857 Indian Rebellion, or the First Indian War of Independence, a well-organized insurgents and a great shock to the British, served as a reminder that the very same imperial network technologies, post, telegraph, trains, steamships, and newspapers also brought the British Empire's vast and varied populations into unprecedented communication and contact with each other, and could become the means and media of resistance. After 1848, in Benedict Anderson's terms, serial forms of dissent clearly exceeded the bounds of the national and created new international challenges and opportunities. Galton predicted that, quotes, the practice of telegraphing profiles of persons of current interest may become common. Not only social media, but also the securitizing technologies that today we understand as facial recognition, computerized profiling, and biodatabases were all emerging in the 1860s as the projected future of binary digital coding. When he returned to England from Australia in 1854, Woolner shared lodgings with his great friend, Francis Palgrave. And he got involved in the social and educational projects of Palgrave's group. Palgrave had been at Balliol College, Oxford, with the poets Arthur Clough and Matthew Arnold, and they'd all travelled together to Paris in 1848 to witness the revolution there, an adventure that I actually wrote about in a chapter called Revolutionary Tourists in my recent 1848 book. Now, Palgrave, Arnold, and Clough all worked in the education office of the civil service in London and were all actively trying to get English literature recognised as a compulsory school subject. As Arnold wrote, this was an urgent question of not just culture, but of race. Quotes, in poetry, the spirit of our race will find, as time goes on and as other helps fail, our consolation and stay. The group was also involved in the adult education movement identified with the Christian socialist F.D. Morris. Woolner joined Ford Madox Brown, Ruskin, Rossetti, and Burne-Jones in teaching at Morris's Working Men's College in St Pancras in London. Palgrave feared the rising tide of ephemeral popular print and felt that people needed good writing to be kept and studied and known by heart. Palgrave's Golden Treasury was to emerge from this liberal network. In the summer of 1860, Woolner joined Palgrave and Tennyson on a walking tour of Cornwall, where Tennyson was hunting for Arthurian sites for his Idylls of the King. Tennyson complained from Cornwall in a letter to Holman Hunt that, quotes, "All day long I'm trying to get a quiet moment for reflection, but before I've finished a couplet, I hear Palgrave's voice like a bee in a bottle, making the neighbourhood resound with my name." Palgrave was buzzing in Tennyson's ear about his idea for a new anthology of poetry to rival William Allingham's Nightingale Valley, which had just been published. Palgrave's draft preface to the first edition of this anthology explains the collaborative process. Quotes, "In putting the book together, all poems which appeared at all available or likely were gone through, after my selection, by George Miller and Thomas Woolner. Tennyson," Palgrave states, "read almost everything twice over and generally aloud, and his opinion was the final verdict." It was in his capacity as a poet that Woolner was part of this editorial team, but his most visible contribution to the anthology remains his vignette of the flute player on its 1861 title page, a motif that was later adopted as the logo of what became the Golden Treasury series. It was Woolner, too, who came up with the name. The title, The Golden Treasury, was his idea. The Golden Treasury of the best songs and lyrical poems in the English language has been described as both a light read and an altar to the canon. But this description perhaps occludes how much agency the volume itself had in the formation of a canon. Michael Sullivan has pointed out that his attention to the Renaissance and the Romantics has great importance for literary history. It had amounted to an attempt to recodify the lyrical canon. Tennyson and his team undertook a deliberate work of canon formation. Not only were they selecting whole poems for inclusion, they were also excerpting the lyric sections out of longer poems. As Casey Leggett has nicely put it, 19th century practices of excerpting let us see the way lyrics isolation and lyrics embeddedness are two sides of the same coin. Sometimes entries were shortened, silently edited, or retitled. For example, Wordsworth's "I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud" appears in the Golden Treasury under the new title, "To Daffodils." Palgrave invents a principle of purity to define the idea of the lyrical as being, quotes, "held essentially to imply that each poem shall turn on some single thought, feeling, or situation." Early in December 1860, Woolner wrote that Palgrave certainly has an astonishingly acute and quick mind in reading an enormous amount and extracting the best things. Palgrave himself described the extraction process in strikingly material terms. The mass thus diminished, but retaining all that stood near admission, was gone through by Alfred Tennyson, he says. The mass, much diminished, suggests a vaguely sculptural image of chipping away at a bulk. Robert Crawford has described Palgrave's Golden Treasury project as a fossicking for detachable nuggets. Quote, "Palgrave may have plundered poetic tradition and carried off the sort of ornaments that fitted the imperial pocket, while leaving behind anything unmanageably large." How might this venture be connected to Woolner's Australian sojourn and his medallion series? Can we identify such a thing as a cultural logic of extraction? And if so, can such a logic work across material and textual zones? Critics have cautioned against, quotes, "the risk of conceptual creep and adjectival ubiquity," advocating that we hold on to extraction in its specifically material and ecological sense as a term that names a disjuncture between extracted resources and the life worlds in which they are embedded. Mineral extraction in the 19th century, and still today, denotes enslaved, bonded, and racialized labor, ecological destruction, the depletion of finite natural resources, and the abandonment of exhausted sacrifice zones. It may therefore indeed be unethical to use extraction as a metaphor. But what if it's not a metaphor, but a structural reality which is coming into play in the print world of the 1860s and which continues as a material fact of our digital world today? Mining for ore, mining for coal, and deep text mining, all are material processes which assume a surplus mass. To extract is to detach elements of this mass for mobilization elsewhere. The gold nugget, the piece of coal, the extract of text, all are deterritorialized by extraction. In some cases, quite literally deterritorialized, removed from the earth and then set in motion to drive the twin motors of global capitalism and colonialism. Antoinette Burton and Isabel Hofmeyr have suggested that we can think about books not just as mobile objects, but as themselves dispersed events, which function in an imperial commons as a site of deterritorialized sovereignty in the textual economy of the modern British Empire. Textual and informational extraction may also, of course, be racialized. Digital biometrics today are usually of fingerprints, sometimes of irises or faces, which are transformed through the extraction of patterns and minute points into usable data. Elizabeth Miller, in her recent work on extraction ecologies, has suggested that literature is not merely a passive register of industrial extraction's impacts. It was the discursive site where this transformation was mediated. So is there a connection then between the logic that encourages young men embarking on a colonial career, quotes, to regard the world at large as a vast storehouse, as John Yates put it in his The Natural History of Raw Materials of Commerce, and the idea of a treasury of poetry, characterized by Palgrave in his preface as a storehouse of delight to labour and to poverty? I think there might be. The Golden Treasury miniaturized a liberal education. It was, in Thomas Macaulay's phrase, a single shelf of a good European library collapsed into one volume. And as Macaulay intended, it was designed to travel to do its work. Certainly, the portability of the Golden Treasury was an important feature, both in terms of its material form — it was a relatively small volume — and its own conception of its contents and purpose, because the fantasy of selection and compression is met by an equally powerful fantasy of spread and totality. As Palgrave says, his volume is also contributing to the building of one massive poem unit. It is hoped that the contents of this anthology will thus be found to present a certain unity, as episodes, in the noble language of Shelley, to that great poem which all poets, like the cooperating thoughts of one great mind, have built up since the beginning of the world. This cooperating and constantly developing or evolving great mind is imagined as networked across the Anglo world, the shared property of all in the imperial commons. Palgrave's insistence in his title on the best songs and lyrics in the English language is confidently reiterated in his preface, where we're assured that here is the best, quotes, and none beside the best. When George Nunez launched his popular Titbits magazine in 1881, he announced that it will be the business of the conductor of Titbits to find out from this immense field of literature the best things that have ever been said or written, and weekly to place them before the public for 1 penny. Print historian Mark Turner hears in this an echo of Matthew Arnold's influential 1864 essay, The Function of Criticism at the Present Time, in which Arnold argued that criticism should be politically disinterested and focus on knowing and articulating, quotes, the best that is known and thought in the world. Indeed, Arnold returned to this formulation in many of his essays of the 1860s, some of which he later repackaged in volume form as Culture and Anarchy. He defines culture in the preface to Culture and Anarchy as, quotes, being a pursuit of our total perfection by means of getting to know the best which has been thought and said in the world. Here, Arnold also explicitly racializes culture and the idea of the best, noting that our race have done such great things in poetry, which requires a true delicacy of spiritual perception. The poet John Silken perceptively notes a tension in the Palgrave anthology between nation and race. He claims that the anthology aspires to a version of universality through its English rather than British language, but in reality it offers a narrowing Englishness which modifies the very poems it includes. Others have agreed. Robert Crawford diagnoses a certain kind of cultural imperialism whose roots lie in the 18th century. And Natalie Houston sees it as a piece of well-packaged cultural capital. Narrow and well-packaged suggests a tight, even impenetrable form. But Palgrave himself throws open the doors to his treasury. He conceptualizes the anthology as a series of airy public cultural spaces. But the gallery, this is a quote, but the gallery which this book offers to the reader will aid him more than any preface. It is a royal palace of poetry which he is invited to enter. The book is variously described as a treasury, a gallery, a public place, a public palace, even a symphony which welcomes the reader into a concert hall. Bartholomew Brinkman has claimed that Palgrave's Golden Treasury posits a category of transcendently fixed value and aspires to fossilize the best specimens for all time. But this is wrong, I think. Palgrave's work is much more dynamic and process-driven than this, and its cultural imperialism is not fixed and fossilized any more than fossil fuels are. This is liquefied poetry, extracted and put into circulation around the Anglosphere. Right from its inception, the Golden Treasury is conceived as having a serial life. It's a mobile object designed to travel transnationally. This is clear in its formatting. The 4 divisions of the book are marked by date, but also by the distinguishing character given to each one, by Shakespeare, Milton, Gray, and Wordsworth. The poems are not arranged in a, quote, rigidly chronological sequence, but in gradations of feeling or subject to reflect the natural growth and evolution of our poetry. Natural growth and evolution are far from closed or fossilized terms in the 1860s. They're live terms of development, possibility, and open-endedness. Woolner, Arnold, and Palgrave shared a progressive liberalism that was racialized, but not fossilized. And indeed, the ongoing print life of Palgrave's Golden Treasury did fulfill the promise of seriality that was already coded into this first volume. Nearly 40 years after the success of the book, Palgrave incorporated the near-contemporary Victorian poets into a second series. But even well before this, capitalizing on the extraordinary success of the Treasury, which did sell many, many thousands of volumes, Macmillan launched the Golden Treasury series of books, for which Palgrave would edit volumes of verse by Shakespeare, Keats, Herrick, and Tennyson, in addition to the Golden Treasury anthologies, which kept coming out. Matthew Arnold himself edited a volume of Wordsworth's poems in the series, and Woolner continued to be very much involved. The Golden Treasury series would eventually amount to more than 90 titles and ran from 1862 until 2001. Like Woolner's medallion seeds, the Golden Treasury was generative, bearing within itself the seeds of its own supplementarity and growth. And those seeds travelled far. Sir Alexander Grant wrote to Palgrave from Bombay on the 11th of July, 1862. The Golden Treasury is an immense comfort out here. Hewlings and I had been talking of it for some time, and we were waiting to see if it would not be suitable as an English class book for the higher native students. I hope you won't think this is a degradation. English poetry is to these people what Homer is to us. The Treasury had barely arrived in India before it slid easily into place as a foundational civilizational white text. And it made its way to Melbourne too. In 1876, the Golden Treasury is advertised as an additional set text for the exhibition examinations for the University of Melbourne. Annette Campbell-White, whose peripatetic childhood took her from New Zealand to Zambia to Canada to South Africa and finally to London, remembers that her mother, quotes, carried with her wherever we travelled a battered copy of Palgrave's Golden Treasury. And in Mauritius, an old man who was a young schoolboy in the 1940s remembers that he had won the book as a first prize in English literature in Form 3 and can still recite whole poems from Palgrave. In a 1996 essay, Partha Chatterjee uses Palgrave's Golden Treasury as a semi-comic marker of the cultural imperialism that does not only run alongside the violence of other kinds of imperialism, but is part and parcel of that violence. Many years ago, I read a book in which it was said that although the British were rogues and bloodthirsty murderers, they nevertheless united India, and by giving it the railways and the rule of law and Palgrave's Golden Treasury, made it a modern country. Railways and Palgrave's anthology are both infrastructural, underpinning a compressive and extractive logic that's well on the way to becoming a digital logic. So I've been arguing today that Woolner's medallions and Palgrave's Golden Treasury were conceived as white colonial container objects. But they're not closed or static containers. The motive power in both cases was their seriality. Like a digital data series which dematerializes and deterritorializes information, they're compressed and portable, rematerializing in every new destination. Emphatically, they do not assert their aesthetic forms as apart or separate or even complete. Woolner's medallions suggest an architecture of the future, and Palgrave's Golden Treasury is a series developing with, quotes, the natural growth and evolution of our poetry. As serials, they cannot be severed from the world, or to put it another way, and to reverse Jennifer Roberts' terms, they must have some modicum of flux to go with their fix. They remain attached to the world by their porosity, and it is this fix and flux that makes them so successful as the mobile instruments of a developing liberal imperialism in the 1860s. Thank you very much.
Thank you for such an insightful lecture, Professor Pettitt. We'll now begin our Q&A session and we'll open the floor to the audience's questions. Before we get started, I'd like to invite our lecturer, Professor Pettitt, and our session's moderator, Professor Daniel Wright, to the main seating area.
So yeah, we have some time for questions. Please feel very free to get us started. I can take my, oh yes, please go ahead.
Already not following the rules. That was a brilliant lecture. Thank you very much. My name is Pamela Clausen. I'm in the Department for the Study of Religion here at U of T. I want to take us way back to that first picture that you showed. And was there a tiny baby's hand in there? And can you tell us about the tiny baby? I have many other questions, but that's my first one.
Oh, okay, is that working? Yes. Yes, indeed. And lots been written about that little baby's hand. Yes, it's the woman is, I could put it up again if you want, but the woman's got a shawl around her and there's a child underneath, just a little hand showing. So Woolner did not take a child to Australia, but I think obviously Maddox Brown has decided to make this into a actually quite angry picture. I mean, this is about want and poverty in Britain driving people to emigration, and it's I think supposed to be very affective that this couple who've just had a baby have to leave this country because they cannot actually survive or make a living in Britain. So there's an affect to that picture which is angry, actually, I think. Were you thinking differently about that hand?
Yes, how? Let's just give you the microphone.
Thanks for a brilliant and fascinating lecture there. I was quite struck by how you sort of conceptualize seriality in terms of space. So I think the modernists, especially, they thought about that way. But just to talk about the Victorians, especially the mid-Victorians, in those terms is quite groundbreaking. So would you mind talking a little bit more about that?
Gosh. Yes. Are you thinking about space or distance?
Yes. Space, largely.
Space. So you're thinking
it's less linear, right? And one direction, like sequential, but rather it's to do with how things occupy in material terms, you know, in space.
Absolutely. And one of the questions I think for this book, which I'm grappling with, is the relationship of seriality to collectivity. The relationship, in fact, of networks to collectivity is a difficult question. And I've argued a little bit with Benedict Anderson, as many people have. But we're all very grateful, though, for having him there in the first place. In terms, and he is addressing that question. I mean, I think he's addressing it in a very Sartrean way, and I think Sartre did it first. So that version, Sartre's version of seriality, is much less about a sequence, a linear sequence, and much more about a kind of a pulling together by one, if I'm understanding it correctly, and I might not be, but a pulling together by one common concern of people who then become a serial of people. And that's sort of Anderson's idea as well, isn't it? He has this idea of the freedom fighter or the revolutionary being a kind of cross-national, serializable form. So I suppose in that sense, there's lots that seriality is not necessarily helpfully going to be one thing. And therefore, it's a very slippery term and a dangerous one. And I get into trouble for this quite a lot. But I find it quite a useful conceptual term to work with. And I do think that I've got to get better at this, but there's something going on about digital seriality, which of course, I mean, the digital really is many of you will know much better and much more about the digital than me, but it's founded on binary serial data, and the ways in which that is modeling more and more from the 1860s onwards empire and our experiences and understandings of the world. And that has become quite extreme these days. So I'm very interested in the origins of that. I haven't quite persuaded myself yet, and you're really welcome to attack this. I think this is it's a very patchy piece of work, this, and I think there's a lot of problems with it. So I'm very happy to hear about them as well, because I'm just trying. It's a bit jumpy, but I'm trying to sort of work out if there's a project here. Really, could I do this? Could I really suggest that the digital is starting much earlier, in a sense, to organize us than we tend to normally think? I mean, I think that's true, but can I persuade the rest of you? I don't know. That's what I'm sort of
Thank
trying
you.
to do,
Thanks
beginning
so
to try
much.
to do.
Yeah. I think there's a bit of that in Peter's presentism and Wilde, a little bit of that
Yes.
too. But then they're post the temporary period you look into.
Yes,
So,
yes, I will just about get that far, I think.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you.
No, good question, thank you.
Thanks very much. I really appreciated the way you were able to bring in so many different kinds of data and material into this talk. It's really fascinating. The word Palgrave made me think of Palgrave Macmillan, the publisher. I wonder if there's a connection, but also I'm thinking about the impact of publishers in all of what you're talking about. I know in my field now, constantly we're being asked to contribute to dictionaries and encyclopedias, and they're putting all their efforts, financial efforts, into those kinds of volumes rather than monographs, which don't make any money. So, and to me, this has happened in the last 10, 15 years, this experience. So there are periods when it's significant and periods, I guess, when it's less significant. Anyway, I wonder what you think about publishers in all of this.
That's really interesting. You're quite right. I've noticed the same phenomenon. And now, of course, we have AI, which will do it all for us anyway. So yeah, they'll stop asking us even for the encyclopedia entries soon. Yes, I think I hadn't thought enough about that. You're quite right. But in a sense, I think in 1860, I think it's Palgrave and yes, it's the same family and yeah. That really I mean, I think it's a fluke in some ways that this book does so well. And maybe that starts to float a kind of capitalist publishing empire. Well, it does. It's a bit that it's the Harry Potter of the 1860s in a way. It subsidizes a lot of other publishing. So it's a sort of reverse situation in a way, and that I don't think, if you were suggesting in a sense that publishers are in control and running everything, no, tell me more. Mediating, certainly, yes. But I do think that publishing changes a lot between in fact, what I'm thinking about Wilde, it changes hugely between 1850 and 1880 in Britain anyway. And the publishing in the 1880s and 90s is driving things far more. I think at this point, less so. But I am really interested in what are you suggesting that this is the beginning of a well, it's not the beginning, but it's the intensification of this sort of exerting mentality. Is that what you're getting at? That it's the publishers who then pick that up and want to.
No, all I was thinking is that publishers play an enormous role in seriality,
Yes.
producing encyclopedias and anthologies and all of that, and that they are part of the picture you're saying.
Yeah,
I'm
definitely.
not saying anything about cause and effect.
I get what you mean. Yeah, okay. And I've done, that was something I definitely started off with in the first book, Serial Forms. I was really interested in print and how print was it really, print was the serial, not just for fiction, but for all kinds of different writing and conceptual ideas and so on. And I followed the print very much in that book. It's much more difficult to do that in the later period where there's just even more of it. But yeah, it's a really good thought. I'm not sure how I'm going to do that. I'm not sure, because it was sort of easier in a sense to sort of look at ephemeral print in the 1820s than it would be to look at massive publishers' outputs. Yeah. It becomes a different project, doesn't it? And an interesting one, but I'm not really a publishing historian, so I think I might steer clear of it a bit.
Thank you.
Thank you again. I thought this talk was so insightful, and I really was struck by the sort of the poetic valences when you were talking about castings and being cast in whiteness. I just found that to be very moving and disturbing in a proper way. But I wanted to ask you a little bit, I wanted to just invite you to speak about that tension you were talking about between liberalism and imperialism. And I was curious if the distinction between political liberalism, economic liberalism, and their unhappy marriage in situations of empire, how that kind of comes out when you think about Palgrave and lyric, because like it's an ironic thing that Shelley and like is the voice of
Yeah.
liberal imperialism, you know, and like what do you,
Or isn't really. I mean,
Or
we
isn't,
can't do
right?
that to Shelley, can we? But it's being co-opted in some ways. Yeah. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you know, you were mentioning that nobody sees the irony reading Uncle Tom's Cabin. Does that also happen reading Palgrave? You know, like how do they square together and not sit together?
It's a really good question. I mean, it depends whether you buy my argument a bit as well, which you might not. You don't have to. That Palgrave's Golden Treasury is some kind of version of a colonial and imperializing text. I mean, I suppose I see it as this is the bit at the end where I was trying to say that in a sense there's something very material about this. So this perhaps goes back to what Michael was just saying. It's about material books. It's about materiality. It's not just conceptual. In terms of thinking about how ideas are actually going to mitigate or be imagined to mitigate colonial extraction and violence, that can only be done with an object, I think. And I think this is interesting. Like, so the object of the book is important. And it's weirdly somehow, in a sense, speaks to your question, which is the sort of economic liberalism versus political liberalism and those difficulties. The book is both a kind of a capitalist commodity, but also it's also the sort of bearer of, you might say, faux liberal ideas, and it's sent around the world to these imperial commons type places, imagined as. So there's something interesting about the sort of the ironic exchange that's going on, I suppose, between sort of, you know, gold and books. It's not a fair exchange at all. But there is an economics to it. I mean, there is an economics to what's going on with the publishing industry as well at this point. So I don't know, I'm not quite getting it, but you tell me what you were thinking.
Oh no, it's just that I really buy the materiality argument that
Do
you're
you? Because
making.
I thought that was a
really
bit
do.
shaky, but I haven't quite got that. I mean, I do believe it, but I don't think I've quite I haven't explained it very well yet.
The way you were talking about Palgrave as, especially drawing in Arnold, I found very compelling. The way that culture via Arnold and in Palgrave's anthology is a kind of cultural imperialism, and it has
Yeah.
a certain kind of infrastructure. I really find that quite compelling. And it's just that I'm just struck by the irony of, you know, people who like literature read
Yeah.
these things for kind of, you know, who have beliefs in egalitarian liberal
Yes, and
philosophy.
it
see
stands
that-
outside of capitalism and all of that nasty
Right.
stuff. Yes, and so on.
But then
And
to
the
see-
lyric, particularly, of course. I mean, it's quite interesting. It's a collection of lyric. Sorry, which is a particularly kind of, in a sense, sort of supposedly sort of depoliticized, personalized, kind of individualized poetry. So that's interesting.
Yeah, that's the tension that I was so
Yeah.
curious about.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I'm glad you believe in the materiality.
I think we're going to take one online question.
Cool. So this one comes in from Lorraine. First of all, she says, thank you for your fascinating talk. She would like it if you could elaborate a bit more on your ideas about the origins of the digital in the mid-1800s, particularly with regards to a sort of serial art form that you didn't mention, which is wood engraving,
Yeah.
which she sees as a
I'm
really
guessing
sort
which
of
Lorraine this might be now. Yes. Yeah.
well, she sees it as a sort of relevant analog here, as a
Yeah.
technology that also relies on an extractive logic in a binary code, black and white, cut this out,
Absolutely,
put this
yeah.
in, and which also becomes so important to seriality in the 1860s. So
Yeah.
is there any way you could speak to
That's fantastic.
the idea
Yeah.
of the digital or whether or not wood engraving sort of plays a role in some of your
Yeah,
ideas?
no, I think that's a great question. Yes, and I have written about wood engraving a little bit in the 1848 book because it was really important in that book for thinking about the transmission of images across Europe of revolution as the revolution was actually happening. So I've got a whole chapter on wood engravings and their sort of importance in creating an understanding of the seriality of those revolutions. So making seriality visible and representable somehow. But I think this question's coming at a slightly different angle because I think what was really interesting about the black and the white and the thinking more about kind of the binary coding of images. And that I think does become much more sophisticated. The 1860s, as I think Lorraine will know much better than me, is a major watershed in terms of sort of illustration technology in the journals and the periodicals and so on. And of course, lithography is coming in and so on. So I think there is more thinking for me to do about the ways in which, and I'm really interested in, as you can tell from the lecture, I'm really interested in the visual, and I'm particularly interested in, I'm getting quite interested in sort of facial recognition as well, and technologies of facial recognition. So I'm quite interested in portraiture at the moment, and I think that is something which wood engraving is doing more in the 1860s and 70s than it can do earlier because it's not quite as sophisticated in its techniques at that point. So I'm interested in that. I think it's interesting to me actually that Palgrave was not illustrated except for that little vignette by Woolner that I showed you. Because it's at the beginning of the 1860s, Palgrave comes out. During the 1860s, and I've been working on these in a different context in my work on the idyll, there's a huge number of idylls, actually, they're often called idylls, poetic anthologies which are really based around illustrations. The illustrations are the major important content, and then the poems are sort of secondary. So I'm interested in the ascendancy of illustration in this period, and I think it is definitely connected to the ascendancy of the digital. I wonder if Lorraine can tell me how.
Yes, please.
Is she going to tell me? Great. No, I think that there is the idea of, I mean, there's something about compression as well, which I'm really interested in, and what stays in an image and what comes out of it in order to make it transmissible. How do you make an image light enough, small enough, compressible enough to send it a long, long way is a question, I think, that's already being asked in the 1850s and 60s in a kind of analog world, but it's thinking ahead. It's somehow pre-thinking the digital somehow. Also, I just think the organization of material is happening. This is something that people have already worked on, but the huge systematization of print that's going on, the sort of, the review of reviews and the endless, it relates to Palgrave, the sort of endless exertion and reiteration and remediation of text over and over again into different kind of formats, encyclopedias and so on, is part of this sort of digital imagination forming. And it's kind of it needs to become digital.
Great, thanks so much for your presentation and the answers to these questions. The first is just a comment. I really like the taking back of the biometrics, and the work by Simone Brown in Dark Matters, I think, would be really interesting in the way that she dates it back even earlier in terms of the branding of slaves. Yes. But also the way that race becomes the rationale for all of these projects, and the way that she connects it even up into the present with facial recognition, the way that you're talking about it. But my question was more about towards the end when I was scribbling furiously, so it's partly maybe my confusion, but the way that you were talking about a shift from extractive logic to to digital logic. I think you said that. I'm trying to understand how we understand that shift and how is that really different? I mean, you characterized the digital as being about fix and flux. So what is not extractive about fix and flux? I find that extraction is very much about the fixity of the commodity, of the thing that needs to be extracted, and of course the flux of the market and the circulation. So just how does that fix and flux help us understand or differentiate those two logics?
The logic of the digital and the logic of.
Well, I think if you did
Sorry, I got lost
suggest
on
that we go from extractive to
I see.
digital,
Yeah. No, not quite.
Okay.
And that's probably my mistake. I probably didn't make it clear. I think more that the extractive becomes part of the digital. So that they're not necessarily. That's in a way what I'm getting at. I think in that this is part of the sort of race story of the digital, is that it is involved in extraction or it evolves from extractive logic in a certain kind of way in this period. So they're not disjunct. And that's the difficulty that I was grappling with at the end, where, you know, the quotes I was giving you about be careful about using extraction and metaphor are from that famous article, Decolonization is not a metaphor. And it's difficult, you know, maybe I shouldn't be doing it. It's a tricky one, but I do think there's something, and plenty of other people have said this, we mustn't think of the digital as something which is somehow not material. I mean, we know there are those huge cooling stations out in the desert ruining the planet. And, you know, we know that every message we send has a physical trace and track. And that's something I want to sort of get at, because of course I can get at that in the 19th century perhaps more easily than I can in the 21st century in terms of how the telegraph is working and how, I mean, the telegraph is a wonderful example of kind of, well, a horrible example of extractive and digital logic coming together, given that entire bits of Malaysia were deforested to create to give the gutta percha for the insulation, and you know that it was hugely expensive and exorbitant ecologically as a technology. So I think there's something going on that connects extraction and the digital. That's what I want. Exactly. Thank you. Actually, it's quite helpful thinking about this. That's what I really want to get at, and we'll have to continue to try, I think, because I'm not quite there yet, but I don't know what you think. Do you think it's a doable thing?
Yes, but I think the point that you raised there, that it's easier to see in the past, is only because it's past. And I don't know that they would have seen it at that time.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I wouldn't claim that they necessarily, I think some people, very few people did, but yeah, I agree. I wouldn't claim that it was.
Some people see it today.
Yes, yes, exactly. No, that's a very good point. Yeah.
We have time for one final question. Yes, in the back.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your lecture. It was very enjoyable. I always like the cultural studies approach to things very much, as well as the historically embedded one. I was wondering about this quote you brought in the context of India, where this, I can't remember, names, can't remember who exactly
No,
was
sorry, I
saying that,
bombarded you with
that
names.
for those Indian natives, right,
Yeah.
the English literature or poetry is what Homer is for them. And I wonder how they thought about Homer, who comes from an extremely multicultural context. We don't know whether this was a white person at all, really connecting throughout the Mediterranean, Middle East, Northern Africa, Southern Europe region. So I was wondering how do they think about native and non-native and race in this particular context with Homer?
When you say they, who
this person who was talking about what for the Indians.
these were two sort of British colonial, or English, I think, colonial civil servants in India writing back.
So what did they think about
Palgrave.
Homer they thought it was a white British
Totally, obviously white. Yes. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is something that classicists have talked a lot about, and interestingly, the sort of whitening of the classics
Right.
in the
Yeah,
18th
shocking.
and 19th centuries.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. It would be very
So they
peculiar if
learned
Homer
from the
was
natives
white.
basically to
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
from Homer.
Yeah, so an appropriation of the classical, and something I didn't talk about because it has been discussed quite a lot.
Oh, it's
elsewhere.
okay. Yeah.
No,
Just
I'm
wanted
not
to-
at all. But I think it's really interesting. Actually, there's a woman called Kate Nichols that does really interesting work on this at the moment in England, and she's very interested in the sort of. I mean, there's the literal whitening of the classical when the sort of the polychromo debate about the fact that the Greeks and Romans actually painted their statues with very bright colors, but the 18th century and 19th century Europeans, Westerners didn't like that idea. They preferred this pure whiteness.
Right.
And this sort of abstraction. I mean, there's been some great work written on sort of the way that ancient Greece becomes a sort of holding a pattern of abstraction, something a version of the abstract, sort of therefore sort of bleached literally of all its
Just one
multicultural significances.
And speaking of Homer, it also occurred to me that in the Roman Empire, they kind of reproduced Homer's Iliad, Plinius in particular, and he wrote in such small letters that this was referred to as in a nutshell. And that makes me think about compression, as you were talking about compression, but also about how today my students and I even don't understand in a nutshell as something complete, but as something extracted, tidbits, little pieces, Tell me in a nutshell without giving me the complexity and the long version, and without me, to invest too much in thinking. The 3 points.
Yeah.
Like, what are the 3 points?
Give me the headlines. Yeah.
And that is also interesting to me, how it meant something different, and now it seems to mean that with regard to compression.
That's really interesting. It is. I don't know if I'm allowed to carry on talking. Where are we?
I think that now we're going to wrap up. Thank you for this wonderful discussion.
Thank
for this
you.
wonderful talk. Before you disperse, please just stick around for a moment for Professor Talyamonte's closing remarks. And but first, let's all thank Claire again for a nice round of applause. I just had to do my duty to make sure that you stayed.
Thank you, Daniel. This concludes tonight's lecture. Thank you all for your thoughtful questions. I would like to take this opportunity to tell you about the lectures we have coming up very, very soon. Quickly, on February 7th at 4 p.m., we'll have the Tietzel Lecture in Architecture, which will be given by Professor Esra Akan, Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Architecture at Cornell University, and her title is Right to Heal, Resettler Nationalism and Architecture After Conflicts and Disasters. Online registration for this lecture is currently open through the UC website. Then we will have the 2025 Priestley Lecture in the History of Ideas between March 18th and 20th, with all the lectures at 4:30. The speaker will be Professor Sanjay Subramaniam, Distinguished Professor and Irving and Jean Stone Endowed Chair in Social Sciences in the Meyer and Renee Luskin Department of History at the University of California in Los Angeles. His title is Philology, Botany, and Religion, Euro-Asian Intellectual Encounters of the 17th Century. These UC endowed lectures are a fantastic opportunity to hear from world-renowned scholars talking about the things they are most passionate about, as we've heard this evening. I encourage you to attend, and I hope to see you there. Special thanks are extended to Daniel Wright, Andrew Chang, all students, faculty, and staff involved in the planning of Professor Pettit's visit, Bonnie Huang, who ran the technology and allowed this hybrid event to take place, and especially you, Claire. Thank you for your inspiring talk. No doubt the trope of white gold and many others you introduced to us today will enrich our understanding of the long 20th century. For those of you who are here in person, I invite you to join us for a small reception next door in our senior common room. Please stay and enjoy some food and drink with us. Good night.